Hello everyone, and welcome to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by Motors, the driving force behind multi-site advertising, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters across the franchised and independent dealer sectors.
Hello and welcome to this weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast interview. Today we're delighted to welcome back friend of the pod, Steve Young, Managing Director of ICDP, the International Automotive Retailing and After-Sales Consultancy. Steve is joining us for the latest in our regular chats about trends impacting the car retailing sector and what he's identifying as some of the ramifications for dealers. So plenty of hot topics to discuss, from electrification to tariffs and new entrant brands to agency and lots more, I suspect. It's been a while, Steve, so welcome back to the pod. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Curtis, and thank you for the invitation. I've been listening to the pods whilst I've been potting around doing stuff at home. So lots to talk about, as you say. A lot of water under the bridge over the last couple of months since we spoke before.
Potting around at home. Been doing a little bit more than that, Steve. But yeah.
Yeah, well, the biceps are bulging and the waistline slimming and the grass is growing. So. They may be linked.
You're looking forward to the winter months, I presume, then?
No, I'll have to work.
To get back to the day job a little bit more. But, I mean, as always, it's great to have you on, and I think Curtis summed it up quite well there. I mean, there's a lot going on at the minute that's keeping everybody busy and definitely yourself busy. So, we can't not have a conversation without starting off talking about electrification. I mean, we're seeing now indications, reports that some of the OEMs are holding back on selling ICE vehicles in an attempt to meet their ZEV mandate for 2024. I mean, thinking ahead, how do you think this will hit the dealers? Because obviously, some of these reports have been coming out from industry leaders in some of the media around some of the challenges around what's been happening from some of the OEMs and the impact on their performance. Is this something that you're seeing and hearing across the UK and Europe?
At the moment, it's UK only because the targets don't really come in the EU until next year, and then in a slightly different format. But we'll, I'm sure, see it next year in Europe. In the UK, this is something that we anticipated, months ago. As soon as started to think about the ZEV mandate, then it was pretty clear that there's two ways to reach your numbers. One is to sell more ZEVs, and the other is to sell less ICE. And in particular, what ICE cars you do sell, you try to get the richest mix you can, the most profit. So it's almost two different worlds. Go back to the product shortage, chip shortage days post-pandemic on ICE. What you get is limited choice of high spec cars, and sell like crazy on BEV with all the negative things around pre-reg and so on. So it's not a surprise that it happened. It's we've got pre-reg, we've got cycling demos faster, we've got massive discounts in some cases, and ratios for both fleet buyers and dealers to try and force the ZEVs through. It's not pretty, but it's not a surprise either.
And I mean, when you're talking to OEMs and dealers, I mean, is it fairly sort of common view towards the mandate and the expected levels? I mean, talking about cars for 22% this year and 28% next year, is it, or are some a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more sort of relaxed towards it than others? Is it, what's the sort of conversations that you're having with OEMs and dealers?
I think where the dealers are multi-brand and they're exposed to a range of different brands, then clearly they see the fact that some brands are better positioned than others. Not just because of what they're doing on uh, on BEVs, but also because of the improvement they've made in their emissions performance in general. So, the credits from that side, because whilst the headline number is 22%, it does vary, and there's lots of different ways to, let's say, legitimately hit the number, as opposed to paying fines or borrowing forward and things like that, which I think is, particularly the borrowing forward, is making yourself a hostage to fortune. It's never a good idea to push everything. Well, we know very well in automotive retail, it's never a great idea to push everything into the last day of the month. And the same thing applies to the manufacturers. It's not a great thing to push your problem forward and leave it to somebody else to solve next year or the year after. So I think it varies according to the brands, but some have done have been able to manage it better than others just because of the product life cycle. And clearly some, on the basis of that, can look forward to an easier time next year, even though the percentage goes up. But it's not easy for anyone, and it is causing frustration, with customers. They're not getting the ICE cars that they want, or not getting them promptly. And on the BEV side, you've just got to do your absolute top job in terms of overcoming customer reservations and positively selling a BEV, as opposed to resorting to the pre-reg and so on.
Yeah, because obviously when you think about those OEMs that haven't really got as big of issue than some of the others, because of the pressure that are on the others, forcing them into significant incentives and things like this, that has a knock-on effect, doesn't it? Because suddenly disparity between product and manufacturers then starts to play into it a little bit.
It does. There's a lot of stuff in the press. Anyone that does their research is going to discover that they can get beds from certain manufacturers with 20% discounts and more, and they then say, well, why can't I get my brand X? It's my preferred brand, also at 20% discount, and that's a problem. But the situation with a lot of the brands is that, broadly speaking, their customer base is to some extent loyal, and so someone who's interested in buying a BMW, is probably not interested in buying, let's just say, a Honda, and so they're not doing that discount matching, if you like, but it is there, and it must be having an effect.
And meanwhile, against this background, Steve, we have this plethora of new, mostly Chinese brands who have either recently launched or they're planning to launch over the coming months. And they're mostly focused on EVs. So how do you think this will play out over the course of next year and maybe the next 5 years? And what can the legacy brands start to do to counter this change to the status quo?
Well, I think that whilst we tend to think about Chinese brands and BEVs in the same sentence, a lot of the Chinese brands actually do have a range of product, and they can still switch the balance. I mean, their main competitiveness, if you like, has been on BEVs, but you've got the tariffs coming in continental Europe. It's difficult to see that the UK won't follow at some point, and there have been some hints from government that they will do so. But they've got ICE product, they've got sort of hybrid product. If you look at people like BYD and MG and Chery, so they're competing. A lot of the serious players are competing across the board, and I've said before, it is a steamroller. It doesn't matter what you do with tariffs. The product is deserving of a decent market share, and the product's only going to get better, and it gets better very quickly in China. So yes, there's some wrinkles around, infotainment systems, for example. But if I go back 6 years or something like that, I went to the Guangzhou show in China, and the product was just not sellable in Western Europe. You just looked at the quality, you thought it stands no chance.
Yeah.
But here we are, 6 years later on, and it's just shot forward in terms of product quality.
Yeah.
And then you start to think about some of the features that are in there, and the performance on the BEV side and so on. They're serious players, and in time, not next year, but in time, they will be seen as equivalents of Kia or Hyundai, if you like, which were new brands once as well, and which also went through a very rapid acceleration of product quality and desirability and so on.
And do you think the legacy brands have maybe left it too late? I'm thinking in terms of certainly Ford, many of the Stellantis brands. Can they compete effectively with these new Chinese brands?
I think that they have been slow off the mark. The inevitability of the Chinese advance to me, has been there for 20 years. And even the players who are most exposed to it, so the German premium players, if you like, are very, very active in China, or have been very active in China and very dependent on China for their profits, are still struggling to make a car which they can sell either in China or which will withstand over a few years the pressure that will come at the premium end of the market as well. When you look at the volume players, they're less exposed in China, but they're still aware of it. They've all been pushed back. Ford, Stellantis, the Korean brands, the Japanese brands have all taken an absolute hammering in China. So they understand the strength of the domestic players, and I think that I would say that Stellantis is probably doing a better job. We've just recently got price parity on the Frontera between the BEV and the ICE car. Ford, speaking as an ex-Ford employee with a bit of my pension fund still associated with Ford.
Careful what you say, Steve.
Well, it's not with Ford anymore, but it grieves me, to see where Ford has gone to compared to, when I was growing up. My first two cars were Fords. As I worked there, I always felt sort of loyalty to Ford. Did a lot of consulting work with them in the past, and so you do have to look as a dealer. You have to look quite critically at the brand portfolio you have, and just think about which ones are going to be winners, which ones are losers, which ones are perhaps at risk, and just make sure that your investment is sitting in the right places. And I do think that for any multi-brand group, then you probably want to think about playing at least one or two cards on the Chinese brands.
And what you do at ICDP, you have a view across Europe and globally across the world. What long-term impact will the likes of BYD and a Moda building in Europe have, on that rollout of Chinese cars? Because that's the prime way of getting around the tariffs, isn't it?
It is, and we shouldn't underestimate how quickly they will respond to that. I think you've got to add MG into that mix as well, and then you've got three serious players who'll all be looking to build 400,000 units a year in their new plants, and with the relationships they have with the primarily Chinese battery manufacturers, they're probably going to get first dibs on European qualifying batteries as well for their BEV products. So, if you look at 1.2 million, then, without trying to get into precise maths, it's 8% or whatever, 9% of the market as new capacity. Well, the market's not going to go up by 1.2 million.
Yeah.
So the question is who's going to lose out by, give or take, 1.2 million? And that's means whole brands have to leave the market. And so it will have a very, very fundamental approach. Now, there are reasons to do with the Chinese environment that where they can build a new plant from greenfield to job one in 18 months. They're not going to repeat that in Europe, but I don't think it's going to take them 4 or 5 years either. I would expect to see Chinese plants up and running in 2.5 years, because they're going to pick locations where that's possible. Time to market is going to be as much a factor as anything else.
Yeah, no, I think someone like a Moda in particular has been quite skillful in looking at, I think it was a former Nissan plant in Spain, so it can hit the ground running.
Yeah, I think the Nissan plant is an interesting one in terms of is it viable or not. I mean, I think the former Nedcar plant is sat there idled at the moment. But that I think had a capacity of 200,000 or so, and the potential to expand to 400,000. It's not the lowest labour rate in Europe, but it's there, and probably some deals to be done. So there are a couple of occasions. I think it's a great shame that the Honda plant's been flattened. Otherwise, that would have been a good opportunity. But it's just short-sightedness and lack of industrial policy by not just the former government, but quite a few governments before that.
Yeah, fascinating. So stay with us for the second half of this interview with Steve Young after the break.
You're listening to All the Chatter That Matters, a special weekday episode of Motor Trade Radio, powered by Motors, the driving force behind multi-site advertising.
So, Steve, coming back to yourself and ICDP, I mean, over the summer, you've been hard work pulling together, as well as your landscaping, the ICDP omnichannel cookbook. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what it is, how it was researched, and share some of the potential key takeaways, without probably sharing too much, that stood out for yourself?
I think that one of the great things about ICDP is that we have the privilege of not having to follow fashion, and so I think perhaps in a previous pod we talked about the fact that there's agency presentations in the ICDP sort of back catalogue from 2011, 2012, which still read very well today. Still highlighting the challenges and the issues and the opportunities of agency. So there's a degree of bemusement, I think is probably the best word, at seeing how some manufacturers approach the implementation of agency. And our view always has been that if we're going to change the distribution model, which is what ICDP is all about, that's what it was set up for 30 years ago, to find a better distribution model. But if we're going to change something that's actually worked for quite a number of decades and is the only way that most people have ever bought a car, or their parents or their grandparents, then that's not the work of a moment. And the customer has actually said, "Oh, please, can I buy a car through agency?" That is not the correct objective. If we're going to be customer driven, then what customers are saying is what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to buy a car using a mix of physical and offline, physical and online channels. And that is the customer demand. And we don't see any sign that that's going to change fundamentally in the next few years, maybe in the next decade. So the cookbook was really a response to seeing, what a tangle a number of brands got into in trying to rush forward to the wrong objective in a ridiculously short time frame. And the cookbook is just based on our own thoughts, some of them going back quite a number of years, um, and the observations of what's happening and speaking to manufacturers, speaking to dealers, looking around the world, not just even Europe or the UK, and saying, well, there's a better way to do this, and here's some thoughts about that better way. So that's what's in the cookbook, and it's broadly speaking, it's much more about the change management process, how you implement such a fundamental change to move from a traditional franchise wholesale retail model to an omnichannel model, which might take you to agency, but it doesn't have to take you to agency. But it absolutely requires a move away from where we've been in the past.
Yeah, so like you say, I mean, it's not new, is it? That, if you think about the way new vehicles were sold decades ago, a lot of it was through an agency kind of distribution model, wasn't it? You didn't, the manufacturer owned the vehicles, and you were an agent on behalf of that manufacturer. I'm thinking that you might have different. But I remember the Mini Metro. The Metro was done through an agency kind of model back in the day. But like you say, it's probably thinking about these things a little bit differently.
Yeah, and we've had agency for fleet, particularly in the UK, but it's been copied from the UK into other parts of of Europe, and that worked fine for everybody concerned. So there are elements which are not new, but as I said, the problem has been about the timing and looking at the transition as being an IT project which requires a new legal contract, as opposed to the changes in behavior and culture, and capabilities that are required on both the manufacturer and the dealer side to give the customer an omnichannel experience, and then being realistic about what you can actually do. Are you going to throttle back on the manufacturing volumes to match supply and demand, or are you always going to have oversupply? And if you know you're always going to have oversupply, then think about what the safety valves are and how you're going to cope with that in advance, not have a knee-jerk reaction to a problem after you've gone live and you're sat there waiting for customers to turn up to buy a fixed price offer.
Yeah.
Dealers, the individual salesmen in dealerships, and I'm sure I've said this on the pod before, but it's worth saying again, just reminding people, the individual salesmen in dealerships have been doing dynamic pricing on behalf of the manufacturer, driven by the signals that the manufacturer sends through, volume incentives, variable marketing spend, finance subvention, and so on. All the dealers have been doing is following those signals to spend as little money as they need to in order to secure the customers to match the volume. And the manufacturer has to do a better job than that if you're going to carry on with a situation of oversupply in an agency model. Or you say, well, we can still go agency, but then we still need to give the dealers who are used to doing that job, some latitude to still do deals. Is it the perfect theoretical agency model? No, it's not. But it doesn't mean it's wrong. And if it's better than the previous, total cost in the franchise model, then that's the direction that you should go in. And it's just been far too rigid an approach, driven perhaps by a few of the big consulting firms who have, a methodology and insufficient understanding of how the industry really works.
And anybody listening to today's podcast, where can they get hold of a copy? I presume it's via the ICDP website. They can.
Yeah, if you're an ICD, if your employer is an ICDP member, so some of the UK dealer groups are, some of the tech and service providers are, some of the manufacturers are at headquarters level, then they can actually download it themselves. They'll find it on the website. But for anyone else who's interested in having a copy, then if they contact the project office, it's just projectoffice@icdp.net, then Jane will send them a copy. Unless they're McKinsey or Deloitte or whomever, in which case we might charge them.
there might be an invoice coming along there.
Yeah.
Does Philip Rothard include on that one? I need to. Yeah, I'll drop Jane an email. But, no, I mean it's fascinating stuff, and I think like you say, it's. You said right at the start of that, this is something that you've looked at for many years, and as you said, sort of started off ICDP thinking about that distribution, that whole process from the factory gates to the end user. And they say it's some of the manufacturers have gone down very quickly, too early, and with potentially the wrong objective in sight, and not thinking about that journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
And finally, Steve, last week you shared your latest blog, which was themed around workshops, pretty much as a sort of critical revenue stream for franchise dealers. And it was titled, "After Sales Can No Longer Be an Afterthought." And within it, you make the point that for dealers and OEMs, after sales is still the poor relation to new car sales. Do you think this will ever change?
It's a problem that not only affects dealers. Some of the manufacturers make 50% of their profits from the sale of parts.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't kid ourselves that manufacturers make money from selling new cars either. There are a number of them are in very broadly the same position as the dealers, and why it's that way, why it's not viewed differently. You don't tend to get head of after sales who becomes the dealer principal. There are one or two notable exceptions, but in general it doesn't happen. And the after sales vice president or whatever in the manufacturers doesn't end up becoming the CEO. It's just not viewed as being a route to the top.
Yeah.
Maybe it should be, but it's just one of those things that you have to accept. So I don't think it will change in terms of being the poor relation, but I do think that there needs to be a bit more creative thinking now in anticipation of the product changes that we have coming along. The park evolution is very slow, so it takes a long time before the majority of the park will be BEVs. Even if we were hitting all of the ZEV mandate targets, it still will be a lot of ICE cars in the park in the 2030s into 2040s. So yes, that's slow, but there will be other opportunities that come along and also other threats. So the sales networks will change faster. So on the franchise side of the business, if you start changing the sales network, cutting back the number of sales points, then you need to think about what the after sales coverage is going to be, because once that goes, then the independents are very capable to jump in and pick that up. And convenience is still a very important part of the reasons why a customer chooses a particular repairer. I also think that we hear a lot of talk about the software-defined vehicle and smartphones on wheels and things like that, and people don't really have a consistent understanding of what that is. We've struggled a bit with it, trying to go through some research on it. But if you look beyond, selling infotainment or map upgrades or things like that go over the air, but you start thinking about the potential to change physical modules on a car, which are enabled by software. So a bit like having a DIY, desktop, if you like, and being able to upgrade different modules at different times to get more capability, more performance. Then that's potentially a very strong revenue stream, both for the manufacturer and the dealers. And so, whilst the service requirement on cars will reduce, I think, and more of it will be done OTA, over the air, more of it might be done by mobile. There'll be other aspects of future vehicle architectures that will effectively extend the manufacturing into the life cycle of the vehicle. And will that change the role of the after sales, manager? Will they suddenly become the candidate for dealer principal? Probably not. But it certainly makes them even more important, and it does give them a very strong future. And we have to prepare, for that. It's not a, we must be there tomorrow job, because the product's not there. But we do need to start thinking about the skills and the capabilities that we have in after sales, and how we protect that revenue stream for both the manufacturer and the dealer.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, I think, you say. I mean, how many times have you talked about the value of after sales over the years, Steve, and the lack of focus, or the potential lack of focus on after sales as a key revenue opportunity for the dealers? And as you say there, as we move to a 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, maybe even a 2 million used vehicle park of EVs by the end of this year, early next year, it's still a small part of a 36, 40 million vehicle park, isn't it, in the UK?
And at the moment, we're for good or bad, still protected by the fact that there's an awful lot of warranty and recall work on some of these BEVs. But you've got to assume that will settle down. It has to settle down, and we will then see the impact of the lower service content on the car. And I still personally believe that at some point someone will say, "Hang on a minute, why do I need to bring my car into you every year or 2 years? I don't get my washing machine serviced every 2 years. Why do I need to get my car serviced every 2 years?"
Yeah, it's a lot for food for thought, I think, and as you say, that's a lot to consider. I mean, as always, Steve, it's fascinating having you on, and say right at the start, there's so much to talk about and so much unknowns around what the future looks like around as this transition, whether it's transition towards full agency, hybrid agency, in connection with electrification and potential a more hybrid and electrificated marketplace. But fascinating, as always, to have you on. And thanks for obviously giving the time up to have a chat with us.
Not a problem, Philip. It's also a pleasure to join you and Curtis. So it's always stimulating.
Creates us more questions than answers sometimes, though, Steve. That's the thing with it, but that's always a good thing.
Yeah, that gives you something for the to-do list for tomorrow.
It does. And talking of to-do list, that if anybody hasn't yet signed up for Steve's weekly blogs, then I do strongly suggest you do so. They are a generally weekly blog, very, very enlightening to read. So you can sign up for that on the ICDP website, which is icdp.net. If you're not an ICDP member, then that is available to you anyway, and do have a look at signing up to the weekly blog from Steve. Always a fascinating read, so appreciate that. So, and that's it from Curtis and I. We'll be back on Saturday with the usual headlines, and thank you for joining us today, Steve. Have a great day.
That's a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by Motors, the driving force behind multi-site advertising. Philip and Curtis will be back with the week's big motor retailing headlines on Saturday. Live, on demand, wherever you are, on your podcast feed.